So we have one more speaker before we break for lunch today, and it's a speaker I'm looking forward to very much. We're going to hear about human rights in our region from Widney Brown. Widney is the Senior Director of International Law and Policy at the International Secretariat of Amnesty. She participates in legal standard-setting negotiations at regional and international level and designs the strategic framework for Amnesty International's global campaigns. She's also responsible for overseeing Amnesty's work on global thematic issues. Widney has extensive experience in documenting human rights and human rights violations across the world and has contributed written work to numerous publications. Prior to joining Amnesty, Widney worked for 9 years at Human Rights Watch. She was a lecturer at Yale in public health, where she taught a course in health and human rights. She's a graduate of the New York University School of Law, where she was a Root Tilden Scholar. Please welcome Widney Brown.
Good morning. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet. I have to admit that when I got this assignment to speak about human rights issues in the Asia-Pacific region, I was a little bit overwhelmed. So what I've decided to do is give an overview of some key issues and then drill down in a couple, and then we'll leave some time for discussion, because I think that's where the meat of our this hour can be. This is the beginning of what's being called the Asia century, and it's for good reason. More than 60% of the world's population lives in the Asia-Pacific region. 3 of the 4 most populous countries in the world, and 6 of the 10 most populous countries in the world. But it's also a region of intense contrast and diversity. Next to those most populous countries are some of the smallest island nations in the Pacific, with very small populations. And some of these small island nations, we know, are actually facing the threat of annihilation because of climate change. We, we have well-established economies, thriving, developing economies, side by side with some of the poorest countries in the world. Again, quite a lot of contrast. So as I talk about a few key issues for human rights in the Asia-Pacific region, I'm going to try to sort of categorize some of the key countries in which Amnesty International in particular is dealing with these issues. I want to start with a really classic Amnesty International issue, which is the death penalty. And unfortunately, the death penalty thrives in the Asia-Pacific region. The country with the most executions in any given year by far is China. And China continues to defy campaigning and advocacy to end the death penalty. And in fact, on the very day that Troy Davis's execution in the US got so much publicity, China executed a Pakistani migrant, and Iran, by the way, another major offender, executed a 17-year-old boy. But it's not just China. Japan, South Korea, most of the ASEAN countries, and almost all the countries in South Asia retain the death penalty. And for a human rights organization, I think the death penalty is a real litmus test for whether a country is truly committed to going beyond what's required by law to establish the principle that they care about human rights, and that most critical of human rights, the right to life. The Asia-Pacific region is also a region in which there are many conflict-related violations. Afghanistan, of course, has a war that's been going on now for 10 years with, quite frankly, no end in sight, despite some mutterings about peace negotiations. And of course, our concern as a human rights organization is that if those peace negotiations go forward, that they not go forward at the price of sacrificing women's rights in Afghanistan. As Salil mentioned in his talk, about a quarter of India is actually engulfed in an internal armed conflict, which gets almost no publicity outside of India. And of course, there's also the situation in Kashmir, which has been going on since 1989. The Philippines has a low-level conflict going on, mostly in the south, where there are significant violations, and there's also a low-level conflict in southern Thailand. But another, perhaps one of the most crucial flashpoints in the region is what are heightened tensions in the Korean Peninsula, something that any human rights activist needs to be worried about. Somebody already brought up the question of Sri Lanka. Another issue for us when we look at the Asia-Pacific region is the pursuit of justice. Sri Lanka is the most glaring example of where the government has been utterly defiant in not just claiming that it has no responsibility to ensure truth, justice, and reparations for the victims of the violations that happened both for the last stage of the armed conflict, but actually for the decades of the conflicts, which to this day still has the highest number of enforced disappearances of any country in the world. And they are absolutely intransigent in their refusal to acknowledge those violations and the imperative for truth and justice. And it's an issue on which, as Salil said, we're working quite hard. Nepal is an area in which we're working for justice for the victims of the internal armed conflict that was fairly recently resolved, and we have a campaign actions particularly on issues of sexual violence in that conflict. We also continue to seek justice for the victims of the conflict in Timor-Leste. It's a slow process, but one that we're grinding away at. The thing that you have to do if you're going to pursue justice is you have to be somebody who's in there for the long haul. Just remember, it was more than 20 years after the dirty war in Chile that Pinochet was actually called before a court in the UK. And suddenly, dictators everywhere started having some trembling feelings. And when I speak, particularly in the US, I often say that Bush and his cohort are the next generation's Pinochet, but it probably will take a generation. We also have done work on the Cambodian, the extraordinary chambers in the Cambodian courts, which are trying to bring some level of, again, truth, justice, and reparations for the genocide in Cambodia. Unfortunately, that court, though internationalized, has been quite retrogressive in terms of its attitude towards issues such as torture. The Asia-Pacific region also has its fair share of just downright repressive governments. North Korea and Burma are two that can take probably high marks on that one. But there are many other countries in the region where there's a risk of torture and ill treatment, risk of disappearances and extrajudicial executions, as well as violations of freedom of expression and religious freedom. Some of the ones that we work on and see these as key issues include, again, China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, just to name a few. Another issue that I think you can't not reference with regard to the Asia-Pacific region is the issue of economic, social, and cultural rights, and the accompanying of almost any violation related to that, which is corruption. Now, what's happened in the Asia-Pacific region, and particularly in East Asia, is building on the success of the small city-state of Singapore with its prioritizing of economic growth without liberalizing civil liberties and civil rights, has been the promotion of open markets, in fact, the promotion, quite frankly, of capitalism while retaining firm control over basic freedoms and rights. We have seen a positive side to this. It's important to acknowledge that as a result of the growth in the economy, millions of people have been brought out of poverty in places such as India and China. There remains a question how sustainable that progress is in a place like China when it's not accompanied by the civil and political rights that allow you to demand accountability and information from your government. But it is absolutely clear that millions have been brought out of poverty. What's also clear is that it's primarily benefited people in urban environments. While there are issues of displacement from rural areas to big urban slums, in fact, it is in rural areas that people are being left behind in terms of economic progress and economic rights. And so what we're actually seeing in these countries, as we're seeing in many Western economies where market economies are given such preference, is an increase in economic disparity between the wealthiest people in the country and the poorest people in the country. And we're also seeing that across regions. And this actually brings me to the two issues that I actually want to focus on that I think are critical and are issues that are relevant across the Asia-Pacific region. And the first one is migrant workers. Now, Asia accounts for 30% of all migrant workers globally, and that's split about 50-50%, 50% who are working between countries in Asia, and about 50% who go outside the Asia-Pacific region, largely to, but not exclusively, to the Middle East. But even though Asia-Pacific region accounts for such a significant number of migrant workers in the world, they tend to be the lowest skilled and most exploited workers. Although with the economic growth in some parts, we are also seeing a brain drain as medical doctors and nurses leaving places like the Philippines and Bangladesh to go to developed economies, which has its own issues around the brain drain. So what we have in Asia are migrant workers who qualify as the 3 Ds. They are the migrant workers who end up doing the dirty, dangerous, and difficult work. And I was actually just Googling, my favorite app these days, to see what was going on in terms of any reports of this in Australia, and saw the story of a group of men who were working on an offshore rig that's owned by an Australian company, and they were making less than what somebody working at McDonald's in Brisbane would be making, next to white engineers who are Australian who are making over $130,000 a year. Their situation came to light when they actually complained to the union, but that's the epitome of your dangerous, and in this case, difficult and dirty work. But the other thing that we see of migration in Asia is the feminization of low-skilled migrant workers. And in fact, what we have in Asia are huge numbers of female migrant workers going into domestic work or entertainment work. Now, the problem here is that domestic workers are largely just denied any labor rights protections whatsoever. By and large, there is no minimum wage, there is no regulation of time off, and there is no limit to the number of hours that they can be asked to work. And it's almost impossible for domestic workers to organize to fight for their rights, because an element of being a domestic worker is the isolation in the home of your employer, who may restrict your freedom of movement and in other ways abuse you. Now, I think the fact that we have so many women migrant workers in the Asia-Pacific region who are going abroad to work is also a reflection of the lack of women's political empowerment in the region. And if you look at women's political participation as an issue throughout the Asia-Pacific region, it is one of the lowest in the world, with the Pacific region in particular at rock bottom. The last statistic I saw that looked credible, although I'm not sure how recent it was less than 2% of public officials in the Asia-Pacific island countries in positions of governance. Now, what does this mean for the Asia-Pacific to have migrant work such a critical issue? One issue is that not a single country within the region that is a receiving country for migrant workers has ratified the Convention on Migrants' Rights. And what does this mean? Well, basically what it means is that governments, because they don't recognize the rights of migrant workers, and because they often put up obstacles to migrant workers coming into a country, even though they create a labor market that demands migrant labor, is that you have lack of regulation and exploitation of the workers. So the sending country sends its workers abroad and gets the benefit of the remittances back in its own economy. And remittances happens to be a significant part of the GDP in countries like the Philippines and Indonesia. But because the person has left their borders, they say their rights are not ours to protect. You go to the receiving country, which often leaves them unprotected and sometimes in irregular situations, and then they basically call them illegal, even though they're exploiting their labor, and say, I don't have to protect their rights either. So we have a case of unjust enrichment by both countries and by the employers, while the actual workers themselves are left without basic human rights protections. Now, let's be clear here. Despite all the rhetoric and xenophobia around migration, and issues around the economy in many developed countries now, studies consistently show that migrant labor makes a significant contribution to host countries. And what you actually have are governments that know that nobody will fill these positions, especially when they're dirty, dangerous, and difficult, except for migrant workers, and yet they still put up barriers to their lawful entry, which leads to their exploitation and, again, unjust enrichment. Another way of saying it is we live in a world that not just allows but encourages the free flow of capital across borders. That is what globalization is about. And yet at the same time, it restricts the flow of labor across borders, particularly underprivileged, low-skill labor. And in return for that, when that foreign investment, that free flow of capital, is going into these countries with large migrant labor groups, including undocumented or irregular migrant laborers, they are partly getting a return and profit on that investment because of the labor exploitation. This is unjust enrichment at the price of the poorest and most disenfranchised people, and think about particularly the situation of women migrant laborers who are absolutely at the bottom of the heap. What this means, and what Amnesty International needs to do, is call for all the countries in the Asia-Pacific region to ratify the Convention on Migrant Rights, the Protocol Against Trafficking, the Protocol on the Smuggling of People, and the relevant International Labor Organization conventions. Now, the second issue that I want to talk about that I think is particularly relevant for the Asia-Pacific region is the rights of Indigenous peoples. Of the recognized 350 million Indigenous peoples in the world, about 70% are in the Asia-Pacific region. And if you had countries like Bangladesh willing to actually acknowledge that the Chichagan Hill Tract people are Indigenous peoples, you would have even a larger percent. But we have a lot of countries who actually are denying recognition of Indigenous peoples and their identities. Now, although Indigenous peoples throughout the world account for only 5% of the population in the world, they account for about a third of the people living in poverty. I don't think I need to tell the people in this room why Indigenous peoples are disproportionately living in poverty. Indigenous peoples around the world and in the Asia-Pacific region have been uprooted, annihilated, forced to assimilate, criminalized, and corralled onto lands that their states deem useless. Women Indigenous peoples face three levels of discrimination. They face discrimination because of their ethnicity, they face discrimination because of their socioeconomic status, and they face discrimination because they are women. Now, I would argue that particularly in this region, Indigenous peoples are facing another growing threat. It's not a new threat, but it's one that's increasing. And that is because one of the defining trends of this time is how governments and corporations are racing to secure scarce natural resources. And the lands on which Indigenous peoples live, sometimes the lands that have always been theirs that they have been owners and custodians on, and sometimes the lands that they've been forced to live on because the government actually thought it was useless, are turning out to be often the lands which are actually rich in the natural resources that we now are having a race as governments seek to secure those. And the result is a devastating attack on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the lands where they live. The problem is that governments are so eager to secure those natural resources and the profits associated with them that they sign concession agreements with corporate entities without, as a general rule, ensuring that there is a human rights impact assessment study done, an environmental rights impact assessment done, with appropriate mitigating actions to make sure that those harms don't happen, and in the case of lands of Indigenous peoples, without respecting the imperative as in the UN Declaration for free, prior, and informed consent. And as in the exploitation of migrant workers, corporations, corrupt governments, shareholders are being unjustly enriched at the expense of the rights, the lives, the lands, and the cultures of Indigenous people. As human rights activists, it's imperative that we challenge the powerful, expose abuses of power, including exploitation and unjust enrichment, and that we ensure that those whose rights are under attack are empowered to fight back. There are many powerful actors in Asia. Governments and corporations are just two of them, but we need to work together to make this a century for human rights in Asia, as opposed to the Asia century. Thank you.
Thank you, Widney. Well, I'm sure you've got lots of questions there, and I know I have. Just while you're thinking, perhaps I might ask the first question. Widney, you talked about making this a century for human rights in Asia, and no doubt Asia has, there are lots of human rights challenges. You mentioned migrant workers and numerous others, you know, the rights of people with disabilities and many, many other groups. What we're also asking of them, though, is to think about and consider the rights of future generations, because we've thrown up the challenge of climate change, and on the one hand we're saying, well, we're not really prepared, the West isn't really prepared to take serious steps to change the way we do things, but you can't have what we have, because you're not allowed to do what we've had license to do all along. What needs to happen here to get some traction so that we can offer some hope to future generations?
Yeah, thanks. I remember being in Geneva when we were negotiating the optional protocol to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and this was at the height of the Bush administration's denial about climate change and its impact. And for a brief moment, there was a glitch with the U.S. government in what they allowed to be a public document. And there was a study that Dick Cheney had actually commissioned from one of his top consultants looking at the impact of climate change. And the study basically said the U.S. will survive, that the U.S. has sufficient resources to be able to survive, and basically what it needs to do is build the tallest wall possible and make sure that nobody else can get in. Not surprising. Now, that, as I said, this was exactly when the Bush government was saying, no, climate change isn't real. But I think we have to get over that idea, and this needs to be, this is where science becomes an ally for us, that you can't actually, we don't live in a world in which you can build up walls. If there's anything we know about the world, walls fail us. It's actually figuring out how to reach across the political borders and the borders that get imposed on us by people who want to exploit difference, to say if we're going to survive, we need to survive together. And I think that we need not only to say that about ourselves today, but we are at a point where we're somewhere near turning, I don't know how they know what the population of the world is, but somebody's predicting we're turning to 7 billion sometime very soon. It is sustainability, just of who is in the earth today, is also already challenging, and we really need to think of ourselves as custodians of the earth and its natural resources for our children and our children's children. And again, that means building bridges and working together collectively. But you're right, at the political level, there's short-term interest that says, I want to retain my power, I want to retain my wealth, I want to retain my privilege, and basically to hell with everyone else.
So, come on, don't be shy. There must be questions. Yes, the young lady at the back here.
Well, hello. I was speaking to you earlier. My main concern why I've come here today, I don't really know much about Amnesty International at all, but I have a real concern about human rights, particularly women and the forced prostitution of women throughout the world, not just in this area. And my question is, how can Amnesty International get around the systemic and endemic corruption in a lot of agencies that are apparently charged with protecting women's rights? And also, how can education, perhaps culturally, come into play in, instead of being at the top level, being in the grassroots, trying to get across to people who perhaps come from a culture where women aren't respected, to change that culture? And where does the separation of religion, church and state, if you like, come into play as well, where so many atrocities are committed in the name of religion, particularly against women?
Is that all?
That's it, thanks.
Okay, let's start with the easy one. Basically, for empowering women, education is absolutely key. I would argue that the 3 key elements of empowering women is girls have to have access to education, and that means meaningful access. They can't go to school in survival mode. You've probably read the stories of sexual abuse and exploitation of girls in schools. That's not education. You don't learn when you're in survival mode. So girls need to have access meaningfully to education and of the same quality that boys are accustomed to getting, so that they're not tracked into making soap as opposed to becoming engineers. The second one is that women need to be economic independent, and that it grows out of actually the education. But the key issue is that it's not whether you have access to money, it's whether you actually have economic independence. Because as we know, women can have access to money, and then because of divorce or other issues in the family can actually lose that and end up as impoverished as some of their sisters are. And the third thing I would actually argue is sexual autonomy, and this goes to your concern about the exploitation of women who are trafficked into forced sex work, which is, again, women's body is seen as a commodity, and so women become the commodity that is trafficked, the way arms are trafficked or drugs are trafficked, and they're trafficked into forced sex work and other forms of forced labor. And I tend not to make a distinction, because if you are in slavery-like conditions, one of the indicators that you actually are living a slave-like existence is that people have absolute sexual access to you. So when you're talking about people who are working in sweatshops, you will often find that there's sexual violence and exploitation of women in sweatshops, as well as women who are trafficked into forced sex work. But that means really radically rethinking the way we think about women, because many cultures and religions promote the idea that it's legitimate to police women's sexuality, which means we can tell women what they can wear and what they can't wear. It means we can tell women who they can marry and who they can't marry. You can tell women how many children to have, or et cetera. You can demonize them because of their sexuality. You can exploit them and target them because of their sexuality. And so I think we need to take on all those challenges. But the thirst for education is huge. And I just referred to the fact that the war in Afghanistan has been going on for 10 years. But one of the small, unfortunately is small, but small but key successes in Afghanistan is the number of girls' schools that are thriving post-Taliban. Now, primarily in the urban areas, because in rural areas it's still often too dangerous. But families and girls are willing to risk immense things in order to get that education. And I think that's a very positive sign.
Another lady, same part of the room, thanks.
Carol King from Amnesty's New South Wales Branch Committee. I think there's a prevailing attitude towards Indigenous people and resources that because they love their land, they shouldn't benefit from developing that land and exploiting the resources. How can policies be changed so that Indigenous people can actually take advantage of the commodity aspect of some of those resources in a sustainable way that benefits their future generations?
Yeah, it really goes to the question of ensuring the agency of Indigenous communities and peoples. That it's incredibly important that part of that custodial and ownership relationship to the land is within their control, and that they make their decisions through their own systems of decision making, and that how Indigenous peoples relate to the resources on their land cannot be dictated by the outside. Now, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, with its issue around free, prior, informed consent, as well as many of the other elements of the ownership of the land, should make that happen. I sort of had an epiphany last night about the whole issue of what free, prior, and informed consent, how it's being interpreted by governments, as opposed probably to Indigenous peoples, which it's being seen as if before the UN Declaration you had governments going in basically with their policy de facto in play, and any consent was ex post facto. What you have now is governments thinking, oh, I'll go through a consultation where I'll check a few boxes and we'll call that free, prior, and informed consent. What it doesn't get to is actually the imperative that Indigenous peoples themselves come up with their own plans about every element of their lives, including the use of the resources of their lands, and that is what actually meaningful free, prior, and informed consent is.
Down front.
Hi, Widney. My name's Naswa Nanaris. I'm representing the Australian South Sea Islanders, who are the descendants of some 60,000 Pacific Islanders who were brought to Australia during the late 19th century. I thought it was an opportunity for me to speak now. I'm not representing an organisation, I'm an individual, and I've come to Amnesty International to hear my story about the plight of my people who seem to be completely left out on issues affecting their main issues, which are education, health and employment. The Australian government, now we're talking about, you were speaking about migrant workers. These people were treated as slaves, and I'm the daughter of one of them. I've come here to this forum to try and seek some address on the issues that are affecting my people. It doesn't seem to be spoken about. We're speaking about current issues, and I want to know how Amnesty International may tap into the past and the present situation of my people in Australia today. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually did not know the story until actually this trip when actually Claire was telling me about the history of people from Pacific Islands being brought here to work as slaves, and then in many cases being sent back with no regard for, of course, the consequences of what happened to them. I mean, I'm from the US, a country that has a long history of understanding the impact of what slavery and the lack of reconciling ourselves to that and thinking about what reparations means and justice means and understanding the consequences to this day. So I totally hear what you're saying. As with all things that we look at, it really is about seeking that truth, justice, and reconciliation. I think at yesterday's conference, somebody was saying, you can't have reconciliation without the truth. And I think that's absolutely critical, because if you don't have the truth aspect of it, then nobody's actually acknowledging the harm and responsibility that happened. And you can't go to reconciliation based on false premises of responsibility. It really has to be done together. So I wish you well on that.
Lady down in the middle here.
Thank you. You were saying that we all have responsibility to, as custodians of the land and the environment, and I was just wondering, seeing we all do have that responsibility, and given our rights to safety and health, how do you see Amnesty's future possible directions from the perspective of the actioning of those responsibilities to land and environment?
Yeah, good question. Can I think for a moment? Okay. The way that we're approaching it now, as you know, probably Amnesty International recently has embraced the idea that we will work on the full range of civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. Prior to that, we sort of, we recognized all rights, but we didn't work across the full range of human rights. It goes to the question of whether we should stay focused or whether we need to embrace work on all these different aspects. I would say particularly if you look at things like the right to health, a lot of issues where we, I think, have an important role to play are what public health officials call the social determinants of health, but what actually we would just call the rights that you need in which to be healthy. Now, both as individuals and as communities and countries, we need to have water, we need to have an environment in which there is respect for the environment that's sustainable and use of the resources, again, that's sustainable, but that also, so that goes to clean water, but using water with a recognition of that it's a limited quantity. It's about how you grow foods. It's about all these different elements of how you use resources. Now, Amnesty International does not and will never get the expertise to say how it should be done. I mean, we're not going to become water engineers, we're not going to become agricultural specialists, et cetera, et cetera. But what we can say is that government policies must be predicated on the understanding that access to water and food and land and shelter and a healthy environment is itself a human right, and so they are based on human rights, and therefore their policies need to respect that. So instead of what we've had up till now in many cases, which is just, well, is a lack of regard for the limited nature of natural resources, plus the turning things like water into a commodity. And there's economic arguments about whether privatization of water is more efficient and in fact the way to go. Again, the issue for a human rights organization is not whether or not you privatize water per se, but whether, when the government allows the privatization of water, it enters into a contract with a company that is going to be charged with providing that water in a way that makes it clear that nobody should be deprived of water, which is absolutely critical to life and health, because it is a right. And so that's the balance that we have. And what we, in fact, have seen through privatization is just the opposite. As you know, in the demand dignity work, we do a lot of work in slums. And you will have water being provided through private companies where people living in a slum are charged more for the water than people living in the really wealthy community next to that slum, which absolutely violates, one, the right to water, and also sort of concepts of fundamental fairness. So again, it's not our role to say how you do something in terms of the detail, but to be sure that a government is enforcing policies that are based on the premise that these are human rights and are not negotiable and not subject to the highest profit margin.
On this side, yes, that lady there.
Hi, I'm Danielle from the Human Rights Commission. My question is, you've listed a lot of issues in our region that are, gross human rights violations, and I think that Australia sits in a region, as you've identified, that has a lot of brutal regimes and a lot of very, upfront, very obvious human rights violations. Australia is also a country that doesn't have a culture of human rights, and human rights, as opposed to in America, isn't really part of our lingo. It's not something people generally know about or talk about or feel comfortable kind of discussing. And I think those two combined present a big challenge for human rights activism in Australia. And I wondered whether you had any advice about, for those of us working in policy and law, to overcome some of those challenges, because there's not a lot of literacy around human rights and because we're often compared to other areas where the violations are considered more, gross. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks. Although I have to say, coming from the US, they don't have a culture of human rights there. I wish they did. I have to admit, I was a little, when I read the briefing for coming to Australia for this trip, I was surprised to realize that Australia has neither a Human Rights Act nor a Bill of Rights. And that is, quite frankly, just stunning. So get on it, please. In terms of that question, I think I have 3 points I think I want to make. One is, I think we need to do a better job of articulating what our vision of what a rights-respecting world looks like. As a human rights activist, and Amnesty International certainly does this, we go in and we tend to see what's the violation, what's the abuse, and we focus on that a lot, and it's important that we do that. That is the exposing of the abuses, speaking truth to power, and demanding that it be fixed and that there be reparations and justice, and that's really important. But what we don't say is what the world would look like if you actually got rid of all those abuses and violations. And it's a very, from my point of view, a world in which human rights are respected is a very positive, it's something that you want to live in, and yet we rarely talk about that. Salil just published an article in a journal where he looked at how when there's a natural disaster in a country, what influences how bad the consequences are. And the premise being is when a natural disaster happens in a country where there's a level of respect for human rights, it actually mitigates against the consequences. And the examples that we looked at actually were the flood that happened right here in Queensland about a year ago, not even. At the same time that there were floods in Rio, in the favelas in Rio. And although the floods here were, from what I understand, biblical in nature, there was relatively small loss of life, where in the favelas in Rio, there was a downpour that was, bad, but nothing compared to what you had in losses of hundreds of lives. And the other comparison that was made was the earthquake in Haiti versus the earthquake in Japan. Hundreds of thousands literally killed in Haiti, in a country where there's been no regulation of housing, people live in slums, and then the insecurity post that, corruption, etc., versus in Japan what happened, although the nuclear issue in Japan adds an interesting postscript to that. But the whole idea that human rights actually create a stronger, safer, more nurturing environment for all of us, and that we don't go out and actually promote that as an idea. But I think if you look at these things, you're never going to stop natural disasters from happening, but respect for human rights as a baseline can actually mitigate the consequences of those natural disasters. So that's just one way of trying to create paint a picture of why respect for human rights is more than, as we are sometimes accused of doing, just defending the bad guy. I think the other thing that we all are in danger of, and I'm actually incredibly guilty of this, but we often speak in jargon. We just don't, sometimes we're not very human. One of my mantras is keep the human in human rights. And I think that it's really important that we cut to the chase about what human rights is about. It's about fundamental fairness. It's about feeling safe. It's about feeling empowered. It's about not living with fear. It's about not going to bed hungry. It's about being the human being that you want to be because you feel safe, secure, and empowered in your world to control your own life. And then that also goes to communities and such. And we need to be much more articulate in talking about that.
Thanks, Whitney. I thought that was a really, really good answer. It's a challenging question because it is true that in Australia we're very good. We rise to the occasion when we see people in great need, when they've lost their possessions and they've lost their lives. We're not that good, though, at feeling empathy for people we don't necessarily see. If we don't have someone who has disabilities in our family, or we're not good at empathising with people that get on a boat and need to come here as refugees. Sorry, who wanted to ask another? Mohammed.
Hello, I'm Mohammed from Amnesty. I just wanted to ask you, Whitney, how is AI globally helping overcome the persecution of LGBTQI people in our region, particularly in states like Malaysia and Indonesia?
Yeah, thanks for that. Actually, I just got an email this morning that was very exciting. Both the Seychelles and Palau have agreed, as a result of the Universal Periodic Review, to decriminalize same-sex sexual conduct. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the whole issue, I think, for us in many ways, or the challenge of the human rights community, has been that although the Universal Declaration makes it clear that all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights, in fact, the history of human rights has been, it's about me, but not you because you're different. And that's been across the board. That's been about race, it's been about ethnicity, it's been about class, quite frankly, although we don't like to talk about that. It's been about religion, and it's certainly been about gender, and it's been around sexual orientation and gender identity. And right now, on the international stage at the UN, I would say the most charged fight is actually that around recognizing human rights for people regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's because a lot of governments are encouraging NGOs in particular to promote the idea of their religious values that not just exclude people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity from human rights protections, but actually demonize them. So you've probably all heard about the anti-homosexuality bill. Anti-homosexuality bill. Did I get that right? That is too many syllables. In Uganda, which among other things imposes the death penalty. Now, that in itself is appalling, but what is even more appalling is that movement, that campaign in Uganda is being funded by and large by the religious right in the United States. So a deadly export from the religious right in the United States is homophobia rising to the threat of lethalness for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. people in other countries. So it's Colonialism was bad enough, but please let's stop the exploitation of prejudice, bias, and demonization of people. And so it's a pitched battle at the international level that's being played out in countries all over. And again, I think it's really important to remember that it takes time for things to change, but you can't assume it can't change. And in fact, it was an Australian case that finally brought the protection of people, gay, lesbian, bisexual people, to the international stage when it was Toonen versus Australia, which was because Tasmania had a law criminalizing same-sex sexual conduct when the rest of Australia, to the best of my knowledge, didn't. I don't know Tasmania did. And so some guy named Toonen brought a case before the Human Rights Committee, and the Australian government defended the law. They said, if we allow homosexuality to become legal, then society will go to hell in a handbasket, and we can't have that. Fortunately, the Human Rights Committee said, well, what happened in Victoria and New South Wales? Like, you guys aren't going to hell in a handbasket, are you? And they basically exploded the idea that your society was going to be ripped to shreds if this was allowed. And that was in 1994, and that was the first case that actually brought it to the international stage. But I would say in the 17 years since, it continues to be one of the most contested issues. And I've done some research on this, and one of the things that we're looking at is how governments love to have a scapegoat. And there are many different groups that are scapegoats. If you work in Europe, it's Roma. If you work in many places here, it's going to be migrants and indigenous peoples. But one that works pretty much universally are people whose sexual orientation or gender identity is different from the majority of people. And it is something that people get incredibly exercised about and is used to create sort of a politics of inequality, where instead of worrying about whether you have water and shelter and you yourself are safe, you decide to focus on the group of people that you think are destroying your society. And once you created that politics of inequality, you've allowed the demonization of group after group after group, and it's antithetical to what human rights is about.
Thank you, Whitney. I think also it points to the fact that the separation between church and state isn't as absolute as we think it is in our society. Any other questions? We have time for one final question. Someone down at the front here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm James Vanatakis from the University of Western Sydney. Thanks for your amazing talk. I suppose my question is to return to extractive industries and mining. I suppose what do you think are some of the practical mechanisms to enforce, I suppose, some of the things you've been talking about, and like how do you enforce issues such as pre-consent? Sorry, and I'm thinking here, like, wouldn't it be awesome to like fly people over the Panguna mine in Papua New Guinea, in Bougainville, so they can see what the consequences of mining are, or something like that. So, so what do you think are some of the practical things to enforce these types of these rights?
Make them pay. I mean, in the end, corporations in the extractive sector are there for profit, and if they can increase that profit through exploitation, human rights abuses, environmental devastation, they will do it. There's no question about that. If they can't get away with it, then they're going to have to change their behavior. So make them pay. Now, the problem is that many of the corporations who are the most engaged in the extractive industries are incorporated in developed countries in the north, but working almost exclusively in developing countries in the global south. Not exclusively, but largely. And so when bad things happen, let me give you an example. You all probably heard about the BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico off the U.S. And funny thing, $20 billion suddenly goes into escrow account to mitigate against the harm there. In the Niger Delta, the equivalent of that BP spill has happened every year for 50 years. And Shell hasn't paid a dime, and neither of the other oil companies there, because nobody stood up for the people of the Niger Delta and said, this is not okay. Now, we need to make that happen. But what happens is the Nigeria government, who should be representing the interests of its own people, whether because of corruption or whatever other reasons it may have, doesn't do it. And then if we're talking about Shell, who we've been sort of pursuing, shall I say, neither the Dutch nor the UK, which is where they're incorporated, are willing to bring them to justice. So one of the things that we're doing is developing an access to justice campaign where basically we say you cannot allow a corporation to be this unjustly enriched at the price and lives of the people where they are working, because nobody will claim jurisdiction over the case. And we're trying to do case studies that show the incredible devastation and how the corporations are getting away with it. But I promise you, once they start having to pay, and not chump change, not some subtle, Trafigura paid some measly amount of money to people in Cote d'Ivoire where it dumped a bunch of toxic waste. I promise you, it was probably less than their coffee budget. It can't be chump change. They have to pay what it costs. And once you do that, because all they're after is profit, then you will start seeing them mind their P's and Q's with regard to the consequences of their action. But it's going to take a while before we get there.
Widney, I now have to thank you very, very much for your talk and for raising all those issues. And I know that there are many other things that you want to ask Widney, and you'll have another opportunity this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.